A game of lies, love, and death. Caterina Esposito had spent years preparing for an arranged marriage, a fate sealed before she was born. But before she could walk down the aisle, she was taken by a man who had no right to touch her. Enzo Costa leaned in, his fingers trailing down her wrist. "You were never meant to be his," he murmured, his voice smooth as velvet. "And now, I don't plan on giving you back." Chapter 1. The Unveiling of Whispered Destinies. The scent of aged parchment and beeswax hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort in the sprawling library of the Esposito estate. Caterina Esposito traced the ornate gold lettering on a centuries-old volume, her fingers lingering on the worn leather. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens, the distant murmur of the city a muted counterpoint to the hushed stillness within. She was 58, her life a tapestry woven with threads of duty, expectation, and a quiet, persistent yearning for something more. Her reflection in the darkened window glass showed a woman still striking, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the unwavering gaze of her deep brown eyes. There were lines etched around them, the map of a life lived largely within the confines of tradition. A life meticulously planned, a future already written. A soft chime echoed from the hallway, signaling the arrival of her brother, Marco. He entered the library with his usual controlled grace, his tailored suit impeccably crisp, his dark hair, also showing traces of silver, slicked back from his forehead. Marco, 10 years her senior, was the head of the Esposito family, the capo, a position he carried with the weight of generations. "Caterina," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the arrangements are finalized. The ceremony is set for next month." She closed the book, the soft thud a punctuation mark on a chapter of her life she hadn't realized was ending so abruptly. "So soon?" she asked, though she'd known this day was coming. For years, she had prepared. The marriage to Donatello Romano was a strategic alliance, a merging of two powerful families, a pact sealed long before Caterina was even born. It was a duty, a responsibility, a sacrifice for the greater good of the famiglia. Donatello was a man of power and influence, a widower 20 years her senior, a man she barely knew. She'd met him only a handful of times, formal, stiff encounters where every word was measured, every gesture scrutinized. "The Romanos are eager to solidify the union," Marco continued, his gaze unwavering. "Donatello is a man of tradition. He understands the importance of this alliance." Caterina nodded, the familiar ache of resignation settling in her chest. She had always understood her role. She was an Esposito, and her life was not entirely her own. Her personal desires, her quiet dreams of a different kind of life, a life filled with genuine connection and perhaps even love were luxuries she couldn't afford. "He expects a traditional wife," Caterina, Marco added, his voice softening slightly. "Obedient, respectful, a woman who understands her place." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Caterina forced a smile, a mask she had perfected over the years. "I understand, Marco. I will not disappoint you. Or the family." He approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of affection. "You have always been our strength, Caterina. Our rock. This is not easy, I know. But it is necessary." Later that evening, as the city lights twinkled below, Caterina stood on the balcony of her room, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stifling weight of her impending future. She looked out at the sprawling cityscape, a labyrinth of secrets and shadows, of lives intertwined and destinies predetermined. The Romano estate was visible in the distance, a cluster of lights perched on a hillside, a gilded cage awaiting its newest occupant. She closed her eyes, picturing Donatello's face, the hard lines, the calculating eyes, the faint scent of cigars and old money that clung to him. She felt a tremor of fear, not of the man himself, but of the life that awaited her. A life of gilded cages and unspoken rules, of submission and silent endurance. A sudden noise below startled her, a rustling in the bushes, a hushed whisper. She leaned over the railing, peering into the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man she didn't recognize, his face obscured by the night. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements fluid and purposeful. He looked up, his eyes locking with hers. Even in the dim light, she could sense the intensity of his gaze, a burning heat that sent a shiver down her spine. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent communication that bypassed words, a spark of something dangerous and alluring. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he vanished back into the shadows, leaving Katerina breathless and shaken. She told herself it was just a trespasser, a random occurrence, nothing to be concerned about. But the image of his eyes, the feeling of his gaze, lingered in her mind, a discordant note in the carefully orchestrated symphony of her life. A premonition, perhaps, of the storm that was about to break. And a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of defiance. It would be gone by morning, she was sure. The arranged life always snuffed out such silly notions. But tonight she could still feel it. Chapter 2. Shadows cast by midnight's embrace. The days that followed were a blur of preparations. Katerina moved through them like a ghost, her body present, but her mind elsewhere. Dresses were fitted, menus were chosen, guest lists were finalized. The Esposito estate buzzed with activity, a hive of nervous energy centered around the impending union. Katerina found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet solitude of a library, the only place where she could escape the constant reminders of her approaching marriage. She tried to push the memory of the man in the garden from her mind, but it persisted, a nagging unease that wouldn't leave her alone. His eyes, that intense gaze, haunted her dreams. She found herself looking for him, scanning the faces of the guards, the groundskeepers, the endless stream of visitors who came to pay their respects to Marco. One evening, a week before the wedding, Katerina found herself alone in the library. The only light sourced the soft glow of a single lamp on the massive mahogany desk. She was ostensibly reviewing the seating arrangements, but her mind was far away, lost in a maze of what-ifs and unspoken desires. A soft knock on the door startled her. Before she could answer, it opened, and a figure stepped inside. It was the man from the garden. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing in the silence. He was even more imposing up close, his presence filling the room. He wore a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light, his face still partially hidden in shadow. But she recognized those eyes, the intensity that had burned into her memory.
"Who are you?"
Katerina asked, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved closer, his steps silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough for her to catch the faint scent of his cologne, a blend of sandalwood and something darker, something wilder. "I came to see you," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. It was a voice that promised both danger and something else, something she couldn't quite name. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "If my brother finds you, your brother won't find me," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Unless I want him to." There was a confidence in his bearing, an arrogance that both frightened and intrigued her. He was clearly not a man who was easily intimidated. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to maintain a semblance of composure, though her insides were churning. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "I told you," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "I came to see you." To see if the woman promised to Donatello Romano was as captivating up close as she was from afar. His words were a blatant challenge, a disregard for the rules and traditions that govern her life. And yet, she found herself strangely drawn to his boldness, to the forbidden thrill of his presence. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Danger is my business," he replied, his smile widening. "And you, Katerina Esposito, are a very intriguing complication." He stepped back, breaking the spell that had held her captive. "I'll leave you to your preparations," he said. "But I'll be back. You can count on it." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Katerina standing in the silence, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She touched her cheek where his fingers had brushed her skin, the lingering warmth a reminder of his presence. She knew she should report him to Marco, tell him about the intruder who had dared to enter their home, who had spoken to her with such blatant disrespect. But she didn't. She kept his visit a secret, a dangerous secret that she guarded closely, a secret that felt strangely exhilarating. As she climbed into bed, sleep evaded her. The shadows of the room seemed to dance with his image, and for the first time in a long time, Katerina felt truly alive, a spark of rebellion igniting within the carefully constructed walls of her life. That spark was fanned by an undeniable fear, but it was there, nonetheless. And it felt strangely wonderful. Chapter 3. Echoes of Promises Broken and Stolen. The following days were a torment of anticipation and dread. Katerina went through the motions of her pre-wedding rituals, but her mind was consumed by the memory of the mysterious man, his words echoing in her thoughts. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, half expecting, half hoping to see him again. She attended a final dress fitting, the elaborate white gown a symbol of the life she was about to enter, a life that felt increasingly like a prison. The seamstresses fussed around her, their chatter a meaningless drone in her ears. She caught her reflection in the mirror, a woman on the precipice of a future she didn't choose, a future she was beginning to actively resent. That evening, she found an excuse to slip away from the endless stream of well-wishers and family members who had descended upon the Esposito estate. She sought refuge in the gardens, the place where she had first seen him. The air was cool and fragrant, the scent of jasmine and roses a subtle reminder of the beauty that still existed in the world, even amidst the darkness. She walked along the familiar paths, her footsteps echoing on the stone walkways. She reached the spot where she had seen him, the shadows deep and inviting. She closed her eyes, breathing in the night air, trying to calm the turmoil within her. "Looking for me?" a voice said softly from behind her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. He was there, leaning against an ancient stone fountain, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. He was dressed in dark clothing again, blending seamlessly with the shadows. "You shouldn't be here," she said, repeating the words she had spoken before, though they felt hollow even to her own ears. "And yet, here I am," he replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. He pushed himself off the fountain and walked towards her, his movements fluid and graceful. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his body. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you risking everything to see me?" He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that sent shivers down her spine. "Because you intrigue me, Katerina," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Because I see something in you that you try to hide. A fire, a spirit, a longing for something more." His words struck a chord deep within her, a truth she had tried to bury for years. He saw through her carefully constructed facade, saw the woman she had always been beneath the layers of duty and obligation. "I am to be married," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My life is not my own." "Is that what you believe?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "Or is that what you've been told to believe?" She didn't answer, her silence a confession in itself. He stepped closer, his body almost touching hers. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her face, the intoxicating scent of his cologne filling her senses. "You were never meant to be his," he murmured, his voice smooth as velvet. "And now, I don't plan on giving you back." The words were a declaration, a promise, a threat. And yet, they filled her with a strange sense of hope, a flicker of possibility in a life that had seemed predetermined and immutable. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice barely audible. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a thrill of both fear and excitement through her. "My name is Enzo Costa," he said, "and I'm here to change your destiny." Before she could react, before she could process the implications of his words, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss unlike any she had ever experienced, a kiss that was both gentle and demanding, a kiss that stole her breath and shattered the carefully constructed walls around her heart. It was a kiss that tasted of danger and desire, of forbidden fruit and freedom. The world spun. All thoughts of Donatello, of the wedding, of her family, all of it faded into the background, replaced by the overwhelming sensation of Enzo's lips on hers, his arms pulling her closer, his body a shield against the world she knew was waiting to reclaim her. But not yet.
Not now.
Now there was only this. Chapter 4. The Weight of Unseen Chains. The kiss lingered, a stolen moment suspended in time. When Enzo finally pulled away, Caterina felt a profound sense of loss, a yearning for something she had only just tasted. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion, desire, and fear. "Enzo," she whispered, his name a question and a plea. He traced the line of her lips with his thumb, his touch sending shivers through her. "I know," he said softly. "It's a lot to take in. But I promise you, Caterina, I will not let you walk into that gilded cage." His words were a balm to her soul, a promise of a different future, a future she had never dared to dream of. But the reality of her situation came crashing back, the weight of her obligations pressing down on her. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "This marriage, it's not just about me. It's about my family, about our honor, about everything." "And what about you, Caterina?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "What about your happiness? Your desires? Do they not matter?" His question hung in the air, a challenge to the very foundations of her life. She had always put the needs of her family first, sacrificing her own desires for the greater good. But Enzo's words, his presence, had awakened something within her, a longing for a life that was truly her own. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "I will show you," he said. "I will show you a life where you are free, where you are loved, where you are cherished for who you are, not for what you represent." His words were a siren song, a temptation she didn't know if she could resist. She looked at him, her heart torn between duty and desire, between the life she knew and the life he offered. "But my family," she began, her voice choked with emotion. "Your family wants you to be safe," he interrupted, his voice firm. "And I will keep you safe, Caterina. Safer than they ever could." There was a conviction in his voice, a certainty that both terrified and reassured her. She knew, instinctively, that he was a dangerous man, a man who lived outside the law, a man who could offer her a life of both excitement and peril. He was mafia, and that much she intuited.
"How?"
she asked, her voice trembling. "How can you possibly keep me safe? My brother, he would never allow this." Enzo smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Your brother doesn't know me," he said. "And he doesn't know what I'm capable of." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "I have ways, Caterina," he whispered. "Ways that are unconventional, but effective." His words were a veiled threat, a hint of the power he wielded, the world he inhabited. A world of shadows and secrets, of loyalty and betrayal, of violence and passion. "I need time," she said, her voice barely audible. "Time to think." "Time is a luxury we don't have," he replied, his voice hardening slightly. "The wedding is in a week. I need your answer now." He stepped back, giving her some space, but his gaze remained locked on hers. "Will you come with me, Caterina?" he asked, his voice a low, urgent plea. "Will you trust me to protect you, to love you, to give you the life you deserve?" The question hung in the air, heavy and momentous. Her entire future, her very identity, hinged on her answer. She looked at him, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She saw the danger in his eyes, but she also saw something else, a fierce determination, a burning passion, and a glimmer of hope. A hope for a different life, a life where she could finally be free. The chains were still there, invisible but strong. But for the first time, she felt a power within herself, a growing willingness to break them. She just needed to find the courage. He was waiting, and the night held its breath with her. Chapter 5. Beneath the gaze of ancient eyes. The weight of Enzo's question pressed down on Katerina, suffocating her with its implications. She looked out at the darkened gardens, the familiar landscape now a backdrop to a decision that could shatter her world or rebuild it anew. She began, her voice faltering. She couldn't form the words. The fear was too great, the uncertainty too overwhelming. Enzo stepped closer, his presence a comforting warmth in the cool night air. He didn't touch her, didn't pressure her, but his gaze held hers, a silent plea for trust. "Look at me, Katerina," he said softly. "Look into my eyes and tell me what you see." She met his gaze, her own eyes searching his. She saw the darkness, the danger, the hint of ruthlessness that was undoubtedly a part of him. But she also saw something else. She saw a fierce protectiveness, a deep passion, and a vulnerability that he tried to hide. She saw a man who was capable of great love, a love that he was offering to her, a love that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I see you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. "And that's all that matters," he said. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. His fingers intertwined with hers, a physical connection that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "I know this is not easy," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I know you have responsibilities, obligations, a life that has been planned for you since you were born. But I'm asking you to take a leap of faith, Katerina. To trust me. To trust your heart." His words resonated deep within her, echoing the desires she had suppressed for so long. She had always been the dutiful daughter, the obedient sister, the compliant bride-to-be. But Enzo's presence had awakened something within her, a yearning for a life that was truly her own, a life where she could make her own choices, follow her own desires. I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I know," he said softly. "But fear is not a reason to stay trapped. It's a reason to fight for something more." He squeezed her hand, his touch reassuring. "I will not lie to you, Katerina. The life I offer you is not without risk. It's a life lived on the edge, a life where danger is always present. But it's also a life filled with passion, with loyalty, with love. A love that is fierce and unwavering, a love that will protect you, cherish you, and set you free." His words painted a vivid picture, a stark contrast to the sterile, predetermined life that awaited her with Donatello. She pictured herself with Enzo, living a life of adventure, of passion, of freedom. A life where she was not just an Esposito, but a woman, a lover, a partner. She thought of her brother, of the family, of the consequences of her defiance. The guilt and fear were still there, but they were overshadowed by a growing sense of determination, a newfound courage that was fueled by Enzo's unwavering belief in her. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and excitement, of uncertainty and hope. She took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs, and made her decision. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but firm. "I will go with you." Enzo's face broke into a wide smile, a smile that lit up the darkness and filled her heart with a joy she had never known. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a protective embrace. "You will not regret this, Katerina," he murmured, his voice filled with emotion. "I swear to you, I will give you a life worth living." He kissed her again, a kiss that sealed their pact, a kiss that was both a promise and a beginning. A kiss that tasted of freedom and defiance, of a future unknown but filled with a thrilling, terrifying, undeniable possibility. As they stood there, embraced in the shadows of the Esposito gardens, beneath the gaze of ancient eyes and long-standing traditions, a new chapter began, a chapter written not in ink and parchment, but in stolen moments and whispered promises. The old life was fading, and a new one, dangerous and uncertain, was beginning to dawn. Chapter 6. A dance of defiance and desire. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of clandestine activity. Enzo, with a quiet efficiency that both impressed and unnerved Katerina, orchestrated their escape. He had a network of contacts, loyal men who moved with silent precision, anticipating his every need. It was a glimpse into the world he inhabited, a world of shadows and secrets, of loyalty and power. He led her through the back passages of the estate, avoiding the guards and the ever-present staff. They moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their whispers barely audible. Katerina felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, the adrenaline coursing through her veins a potent antidote to the years of quiet resignation. They reached a hidden gate at the back of the property, a gate that Katerina hadn't even known existed. A car waited for them, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, its engine purring softly. Enzo opened the door for her, his hand hovering protectively at the small of her back. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as she slid into the plush leather seat. "Somewhere safe," he replied, his voice reassuring. "Somewhere they won't find you." He got in beside her, and the driver, a silent, imposing man with a scar above his left eye, pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the labyrinthine streets of the city. Katerina looked back at the Esposito estate, the only home she had ever known, now receding into the distance. She felt a pang of guilt, a sense of loss, but it was quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming feeling of freedom. Enzo reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Don't look back, Katerina," he said softly. "The future is ahead of us." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. She saw the determination in his gaze, the unwavering commitment to protect her, to keep her safe. She squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of her trust, her faith in him. The car sped through the city, the lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color. Katerina felt a sense of unreality, as if she were watching a movie, a scene from a life that wasn't her own. But it was her life, her new life, a life she had chosen, a life that was both terrifying and exhilarating. They arrived at a secluded villa overlooking the sea, a hidden oasis of calm amidst the chaos of the city. The villa was modern and luxurious, but with an understated elegance that spoke of old money and refined taste. It was a world away from the ornate, tradition-bound Esposito estate. Enzo led her inside, the air filled with the scent of sea salt and expensive candles. The villa was staffed by a few discreet servants who seemed to anticipate their every need, appearing and disappearing like shadows. He showed her to a spacious bedroom with a balcony overlooking the sea. The room was decorated in soft, neutral tones, a calming sanctuary from the storm that was brewing outside. "Rest," he said, his voice gentle. "You've had a long night." She nodded, exhaustion washing over her. She hadn't realized how much the emotional and physical strain of the past few hours had taken its toll. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a tender gesture that belied the dangerous world he inhabited. "I'll be nearby," he said. "If you need anything, just call." He left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Katerina sank onto the plush bed, the soft linens a welcome embrace. She looked out at the moonlit sea, the waves crashing against the shore, a rhythmic lullaby that soothed her frayed nerves. She knew that her actions would have consequences, that her family would be furious, that her life would never be the same. But as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. The dance had begun, a dance of defiance and desire, of danger and love. And Katerina, for the first time in her life, was leading. But exhaustion pulled her under, and she dreamed of running, not away, but towards something she couldn't quite see, but felt with every fiber of her being. Chapter 7. The Unspoken Language of the Heart. The next morning, Katerina awoke to the sound of the sea and the gentle warmth of the sun streaming through the windows. She felt a sense of disorientation, a momentary confusion as she tried to reconcile the unfamiliar surroundings with the events of the previous night. Then, it all came rushing back: Enzo, the escape, the villa, the new life she had chosen. She got out of bed and walked to the balcony, the cool tile floor a welcome sensation beneath her bare feet. The view was breathtaking, the turquoise sea stretching out to the horizon, the morning sun sparkling on the waves. It was a scene of serene beauty, a stark contrast to the turmoil that she knew was brewing in the city she had left behind. She heard a soft knock on the door, and Enzo entered, carrying a tray laden with breakfast. He was dressed casually, in a dark shirt and jeans, his hair slightly tousled, his eyes bright and alert. He looked younger, somehow, less guarded than he had the previous night. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in years," she replied, her voice surprising even herself. It was true. Despite the uncertainty of her situation, she felt a sense of peace, a lightness of spirit she hadn't experienced in a long time. He set the tray down on a small table on the balcony, the aroma of fresh coffee and pastries filling the air. "I thought we could eat out here," he said, gesturing to the view. "Enjoy the morning before the world intrudes." They sat down at the table, a comfortable silence settling between them. Katerina sipped her coffee, the warmth spreading through her body. She looked at Enzo, studying his face, the lines around his eyes, the slight stubble on his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead. He was a handsome man, undeniably so, but it was more than just his physical appearance that drew her to him. It was his intensity, his confidence, his unwavering belief in her, his willingness to risk everything for her. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "For everything." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of electricity through her. "You don't need to thank me, Katerina," he said. "I did what I had to do."
"But you risked so much," she said.
"Your life, your position." He shrugged, a dismissive gesture that belied the gravity of the situation. "My life is meaningless without you," he said, his voice low and intense. "And my position, well, let's just say I have ways of dealing with any complications." She knew he was referring to his mafia connections, the power he wielded, the danger that surrounded him. But she wasn't afraid. Not of him, at least. She trusted him, instinctively, with a depth of feeling that surprised even herself. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the gentle lapping of the waves and the occasional cry of a seagull. Katerina felt a sense of contentment, a peacefulness she hadn't realized she had been craving. "What happens now?" she asked, breaking the silence. Enzo looked at her, his eyes serious. "Now we wait," he said. "We let the dust settle. We let your brother react. And then we make our move." "And what is our move?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "We show them that you are not a pawn to be traded," he said. "That you are a woman to be loved, to be respected, to be cherished." His words were a promise, a vow, a declaration of intent. And Katerina, listening to the unspoken language of his heart, knew that she had made the right decision. The path ahead was uncertain, dangerous even, but she was not alone. She had Enzo, and that, she realized, was all that mattered. A quiet strength bloomed within her, nourished by the sea air and the unwavering gaze of the man across from her. She would need it. Chapter 8. Scars that bind and secrets that divide. The day unfolded slowly, filled with a quiet intimacy that both comforted and unnerved Katerina. She and Enzo spent hours talking, sharing stories, revealing pieces of themselves that they had kept hidden for years. It was a dance of getting to know each other, a tentative exploration of the space between them, a space filled with both danger and desire. Katerina learned about Enzo's childhood, a childhood steeped in the traditions and violence of the mafia. He had been groomed from a young age to take his place in the family, to follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. He spoke of the expectations, the responsibilities, the constant pressure to prove himself, to be ruthless, to be strong. "I never wanted this life," he confessed, his voice filled with a rare vulnerability. But it was chosen for me, just as your marriage to Donatello was chosen for you. Katerina saw the pain in his eyes, the scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the weight of expectations, the burden of duty, the crushing sense of obligation. But you're different, she said softly. You have a kindness, a gentleness that I don't think many people see. He smiled, a bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's because I keep it hidden, he said. In my world, kindness is seen as weakness, and weakness is fatal. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. But with you, he said, his voice a low murmur, I can be myself. I can be vulnerable. Katerina leaned into his touch, her heart aching for the boy he had been, the man he had become. She saw the strength in him, the resilience, but she also saw the wounds, the scars that bound him to a life he hadn't chosen. She, in turn, shared her own story, the story of a life lived in the shadows, a life of quiet obedience and unspoken desires. She spoke of her dreams, her hopes, her longing for a love that was genuine, a love that was not dictated by tradition or obligation. I always felt like a bird in a gilded cage, she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. Beautiful to look at, but trapped, unable to fly. Enzo listened intently, his eyes filled with empathy and understanding. He didn't judge her, didn't criticize her. He simply accepted her for who she was, flaws and all. As the day wore on, Katerina felt a connection with Enzo that was deeper than anything she had ever experienced. It was a connection forged in shared pain, in mutual understanding, in a shared desire for something more. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the villa, a sense of unease settled over Katerina. She knew that their idyllic escape couldn't last forever, that the real world, with all its complications and dangers, was waiting to intrude. A phone call shattered the quiet tranquility. Enzo answered it, his face hardening, his voice turning cold and businesslike. Katerina watched him, her heart sinking. She knew, instinctively, that the call was about her family, about the consequences of her actions. He hung up the phone, his expression grim.
It's Marco, he said. He knows you're with me.
Katerina felt a chill run down her spine. Her brother's wrath was legendary, his loyalty to the family unwavering. She knew that he would not forgive her betrayal, that he would stop at nothing to get her back. What are we going to do? She asked, her voice trembling. Enzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a steely determination.
We're going to fight, he said.
We're going to show him that you are not his property, that you are a free woman, that you are mine. His words were a declaration of war, a challenge to the very foundations of the mafia world. And Katerina, caught in the crossfire, knew that her life would never be the same. The secrets that divided them were about to be revealed, and the scars that bound them, both visible and invisible, would be tested to their limits. The quiet interlude was over. The storm had arrived. Chapter 9. A glimmer of hope in the gathering storm. The tension in the villa was palpable, a heavy blanket of anticipation and dread. Enzo paced the floor, his mind racing, formulating plans, anticipating his next move. Katerina watched him, her heart a mixture of fear and admiration. She had never seen him like this, so focused, so dangerous. He made a series of phone calls, his voice low and urgent, speaking in rapid Italian that Katerina could only partially understand. He was calling in his allies, his loyal men, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Marco and the Esposito family. We need to be ready, he said, turning to Katerina. Marco will not let this go. He will come for you. I know, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She had accepted the risks, the dangers, the moment she had chosen to go with Enzo.
She was not naive.
She knew that her actions had consequences, that her family would not forgive her betrayal. I will protect you, Katerina, he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. I swear to you, no one will harm you. She believed him. She trusted him, with a depth of feeling that surprised even herself. She had seen the power he wielded, the loyalty he commanded, the ruthlessness he was capable of. But she had also seen his vulnerability, his kindness, his unwavering love for her. He came to her, taking her hands in his.
I need you to be strong, he said.
This will not be easy, but we will face it together. She nodded, her gaze unwavering.
I am strong, Enzo, she said. Stronger than you think.
She had spent her life conforming to expectations, suppressing her own desires, playing the role that had been assigned to her.
But now she was free.
She had chosen her own path, and she would not back down. She would fight for her freedom, for her love, for her future. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. I know you are, he said. That's why I love you. His words were a balm to her soul, a source of strength in the gathering storm. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that was both a promise and a plea, a kiss that spoke of defiance and desire, of hope and love. The hours that followed were filled with a quiet urgency. Enzo's men arrived, a silent, imposing force, their presence a visible reminder of the power he wielded. They secured the villa, setting up surveillance, preparing for any eventuality. Caterina watched them, her mind racing. She had never been involved in this side of the mafia world, the violence, the intrigue, the constant threat of danger. It was a far cry from the sheltered, privileged life she had always known. But she was not afraid. She was with Enzo, and that was all that mattered. As night fell, a sense of foreboding settled over the villa. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by the occasional crackle of a radio, the hushed whispers of the guards. Caterina and Enzo sat together on the balcony, overlooking the moonlit sea. The beauty of the scene was a stark contrast to the turmoil that they knew was coming. Do you ever regret it? She asked, her voice soft. This life? The danger? The violence? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. Sometimes, he admitted, but it's the only life I've ever known. It's in my blood. But you could have chosen a different path, she said. You're intelligent, resourceful, you could have been anything. He smiled, a bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
Perhaps, he said.
But then I wouldn't have met you. His words were a simple statement of fact, but they carried a weight of emotion that resonated deep within her. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. And I wouldn't have met you, she said softly. And that would have been a tragedy. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the gentle lapping of the waves and the beating of their hearts. A glimmer of hope, fragile but persistent, shone through the gathering storm. They had found each other, and that, they both knew, was worth fighting for. The night was dark, but they were not alone, and they would face whatever came together. Chapter 10. The Price of Loyalty, the Cost of Love. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a phone call. Enzo answered it, his face hardening, his voice turning cold and clipped. Caterina watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew, instinctively, that the call was from Marco. He's coming, Enzo said, hanging up the phone. His eyes met Caterina's, a mixture of determination and apprehension in their depths. He's bringing men. A lot of them. Caterina felt a chill run down her spine. Her brother's reputation was well known. He was ruthless, unforgiving, and fiercely protective of the family's honor. She knew that he would not hesitate to use violence to get her back. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve firm. We fight, Enzo replied, his voice unwavering. We protect what's ours. He turned his men, issuing orders in rapid Italian. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing the perimeter, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The villa, once a sanctuary of peace and tranquility, transformed into a fortress, ready for war. Caterina watched them, her mind racing. She had never been involved in anything like this before. The violence, the danger, the sheer audacity of it all, it was overwhelming. But she was not afraid. Not for herself, at least. She was afraid for Enzo, for the men who were risking their lives for her, for the love that had blossomed so unexpectedly in the midst of chaos. Enzo came to her, taking her hands in his. "I need you to stay inside," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Stay in the bedroom, lock the door, and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "But I want to help," she protested, her voice filled with a newfound courage. He shook his head. "You've already helped, Katerina," he said. "You've given me something to fight for. Now, let me protect you." He kissed her, a fierce, passionate kiss that spoke of love and desperation, of hope and fear. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night, joining his men, preparing for battle. Katerina retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind her. She paced the floor, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She prayed for Enzo's safety, for the safety of his men, for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. But she knew, deep down, that peace was unlikely. This was the Mafia. Blood feuds and betrayals were their currency. The sound of gunfire shattered the silence, a staccato burst of violence that sent shivers down her spine. She pressed her ear against the door, trying to make sense of the chaos outside. She heard shouts, screams, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity. Katerina huddled in the corner of the room, her hands clasped in prayer, her heart pounding in her chest. She imagined Enzo out there, fighting for her, risking his life for her love. Finally, after hours of agonizing suspense, the gunfire subsided. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. Katerina held her breath, waiting, listening, her senses on high alert. She heard footsteps approaching the door, slow, deliberate steps. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it Enzo? Or was it Marco? The doorknob turned, slowly, agonizingly. Katerina braced herself, ready to face whatever awaited her on the other side. The price of loyalty, the cost of love, she was about to find out what they truly meant. The door creaked open, revealing Chapter 11, Where Fear Meets Courage. The door swung open, revealing Enzo, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He was covered in dust and grime, his clothes torn, a streak of blood across his cheek. But his eyes, those intense, dark eyes, were filled with a fierce relief, a triumphant light. "Katerina," he breathed, his voice hoarse but filled with emotion. She rushed into his arms, her body trembling with relief, her tears flowing freely. He held her tight, his embrace a haven of safety in the midst of the chaos. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Are you hurt?" He pulled back slightly, his hands cupping her face. "I'm fine," he said, his voice reassuring. "Just a few scratches. Nothing serious." She examined him closely, her fingers tracing the line of the cut on his cheek. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll that the battle had taken on him. But she also saw his strength, his resilience, his unwavering determination. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is it over?" He nodded, his gaze holding hers. "It's over," he said. "Marco, he's gone." Katerina felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Relief, certainly, that the violence was over, that Enzo was safe. But also a pang of sadness, a sense of loss, for the brother she had once known, the family she had lost. He wouldn't listen, Enzo said, his voice filled with a weary sadness. He wouldn't accept that you had chosen a different life. He was blinded by his pride, by his sense of honor. Katerina knew that Enzo was speaking the truth. Her brother had always been stubborn, unyielding, his loyalty to the family absolute. He had never understood her, never seen her as anything more than a pawn in their world of power and tradition. His version of honor had no room for her happiness. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted this. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Enzo pulled her close again, his arms wrapping around her in a protective embrace. "It's not your fault, Katerina," he said softly. "You did nothing wrong. You simply chose to be free." He kissed her forehead, a tender gesture that spoke of love and forgiveness, of hope and a new beginning. They stood there for a long moment, embraced in the silence, the aftermath of the battle a stark reminder of the price they had paid for their freedom. The villa was damaged, the garden scarred, the air still thick with the scent of gunpowder and loss. But as Katerina looked at Enzo, at the love and determination in his eyes, she knew that they had made the right choice. They had faced their fears, they had fought for their love, and they had won.
What happens now?
She asked, her voice filled with a newfound strength. Enzo smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. Now, he said, we rebuild. We create a new life, a life of our own choosing, a life filled with love. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers.
Come, he said.
Let's leave this place. Let's start our new life together. They walked out of the villa, hand in hand, leaving behind the wreckage of the past, stepping into the uncertain but hopeful dawn of a new future. The fear was still there, a lingering shadow, but it was overshadowed by the courage they had found in each other, the love that had blossomed in the midst of chaos, the unwavering belief in a life together. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. They both knew that. But they would face it, as they faced everything, as one. Chapter 12. Whispers of Betrayal in the Dark. The days following the confrontation at the villa were a blur of activity. Enzo, with his characteristic efficiency, arranged for the damage to be repaired, the bodies to be disposed of, the whispers of the battle to be silenced. He moved with a quiet authority, his network of contacts working tirelessly to erase any trace of the violence that had transpired. Katerina, meanwhile, tried to process the events that had unfolded, the rapid shift in her life, the loss of her brother, the uncertain future that lay ahead. She felt a strange mixture of grief and relief, of guilt and freedom. Enzo was her constant support, her anchor in the storm. He was patient and understanding, allowing her to grieve, to process her emotions, to come to terms with the new reality of her life. He never pressured her, never pushed her. He simply loved her, unconditionally, unwavering. They moved to a new location, a secluded estate even more remote than the previous one. Enzo explained that it was a necessary precaution, a way to ensure their safety, to avoid any further confrontations with the remnants of the Esposito family or any other rivals who might see their vulnerability as an opportunity. The new estate was beautiful, a sprawling villa surrounded by lush gardens and breathtaking views of the countryside. It was a sanctuary, a place where they could heal, rebuild, and start their new life together. But despite the idyllic surroundings, a sense of unease lingered in the air. Katerina noticed a subtle shift in Enzo's demeanor. He was more guarded, more secretive, spending hours on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, his face often etched with worry. She tried to talk to him about it, to understand what was troubling him, but he brushed her concerns aside, assuring her that everything was fine, that he was simply taking care of business. One evening, as they were having dinner on the terrace, Katerina decided to confront him. "Enzo," she said softly, "please tell me what's going on. I know something's wrong." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "It's complicated," he said finally. "There are things happening within the family, things that I can't fully explain." "Try me," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not a child, Enzo. I deserve to know the truth." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There are rumors," he said, his voice low. "Whispers of betrayal. Someone within my own family is working against me." Katerina felt a chill run down her spine. Betrayal was a common theme in the mafia world, a constant threat, a shadow that lurked in every corner. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who would betray you?" Enzo shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "That's what I'm trying to find out. But I have my suspicions." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "This is the life I was born into, Katerina," he said. "A life of secrets and lies, of loyalty and betrayal, of violence. I try to shield you from it, but I can't. Not anymore." Katerina reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I'm with you, Enzo. Whatever happens, We'll face it together. His grip tightened on hers, a silent acknowledgement of her strength, her courage, her unwavering love. But the whispers of betrayal lingered in the air, a dark cloud hanging over their newfound happiness, a reminder that in the mafia world, trust was a fragile commodity and love a dangerous weapon. The idyllic peace was shattered, replaced by a growing sense of unease, a premonition of the storms yet to come. The darkness had found them again. Chapter 13. The Unraveling Threads of Fate. The following days were filled with a growing tension, a sense of impending doom that hung heavy in the air. Enzo became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours locked in his study, making phone calls, meeting with his trusted lieutenants, trying to uncover the source of the betrayal that threatened to destroy everything he had built. Katerina tried to be patient, to be understanding, but the secrecy, the constant worry, the feeling of being shut out began to take its toll. She felt like she was living in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury and beauty, but isolated, alone, cut off from the man she loved. One afternoon, she found Enzo in the garden, staring out at the distant horizon, his face etched with a deep sadness. She approached him quietly, placing a hand on his arm. "Enzo," she said softly, "please talk to me. What's happening?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with a pain that she had never seen before. "It's worse than I thought," he said, his voice hoarse. "The betrayal runs deep. It's someone I trusted, someone I considered family." Katerina felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated for a moment, as if struggling to find the words. "My cousin Alessandro," he said finally. "He's been working with the Romanos, plotting against me, planning to take over the family." Katerina was stunned. Alessandro had always seemed so loyal, so devoted to Enzo. She had met him several times, and he had always been charming, polite, respectful. It was hard to believe that he was capable of such treachery.
But why?
She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Why would he do this? Enzo sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"Greed," he said. "Power."
The same reasons that drive all betrayals in this world. He believes he's entitled to more, that I'm weak, that I'm unfit to lead. He was, after all, the one who took a bride by force. Even if Katerina now loved him, that was not a mark of strength in the mafia world. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Enzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a steely determination.
"I'm going to fight," he said.
"I'm going to protect what's mine. My family, my position, my you." Katerina reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Be careful, Enzo," she said. "Please be careful." He covered her hand with his touch sending a familiar jolt of electricity through her. "I will," he said. "I promise you, I will not let him win." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a protective embrace. "I love you, Katerina," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "More than anything in the world." "I love you too, Enzo," she replied, her voice choked with tears. They stood there for a long moment, embraced in the silence, the setting sun casting long shadows across the garden. The beauty of the scene was a stark contrast to the turmoil that was brewing within the family, the unraveling threads of fate threatening to tear them apart. The whispers had become shouts, the shadows had deepened, and the battle lines were drawn. Katerina knew that the coming days would be a test of their love, their loyalty, their courage. And she prayed that they would be strong enough to survive. The storm was gathering force, and its center was closer than they knew. Chapter 14. A haven found in forbidden arms. Despite the looming threat of Alessandro's betrayal, Enzo and Katerina found moments of solace in each other's arms. The danger that surrounded them seemed to heighten their connection, intensifying their love, deepening their bond. They clung to each other, drawing strength from their shared vulnerability, finding refuge in the sanctuary of their forbidden love. They spent their days exploring the sprawling estate, discovering hidden gardens, secluded paths, breathtaking views. They talked for hours, sharing their hopes and dreams, their fears and insecurities, revealing pieces of themselves that they had never shared with anyone else. Enzo taught Caterina about the intricacies of the mafia world, the unspoken rules, the codes of honor, the constant threat of violence and betrayal. He showed her how to handle a gun, how to defend herself, how to survive in a world where danger lurked around every corner. Caterina, in turn, taught Enzo about the beauty of art, the power of literature, the solace of music. She showed him a world beyond the violence and the darkness, a world of creativity, of imagination, of hope. They found a balance, a harmony, a connection that transcended their different backgrounds, their contrasting experiences, their unconventional love. They were two souls, drawn together by fate, united by a shared desire for something more. One evening, as they were sitting on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in a vibrant tapestry of colors, Enzo turned to Caterina, his eyes filled with a deep tenderness. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I never thought I could find someone like you, someone who could see past the darkness, someone who could love me." Caterina reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face. "And I never thought I could find someone like you," she said softly. "Someone who could make me feel so alive, so free, so loved." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, passionate kiss that spoke of 1,000 unspoken words, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that was both a promise and a beginning. They made love that night, under the watchful gaze of the moon, their bodies entwined, their souls connected, their hearts beating as one. It was an act of defiance, a celebration of their love, a reaffirmation of their commitment to each other, a moment of pure, unadulterated bliss. In the aftermath of their passion, they lay in each other's arms, the silence broken only by the gentle rhythm of their breathing. Caterina felt a sense of peace, a contentment she had never known before. She had found her haven, her sanctuary, her home. But even in the midst of their happiness, the shadow of Alessandro's betrayal loomed, a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them, the fragility of their newfound peace. Enzo stirred, his arm tightening around her. "We need to be prepared," he said, his voice serious. "Alessandro will make his move soon. We need to be ready for him." Caterina nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that the coming days would be a test of their strength, their courage, their love. But she was not afraid. She was with Enzo, and that was all that mattered. They held each other close, finding solace in their shared vulnerability, drawing strength from their forbidden love, preparing for the storm that was about to break. The haven they had found was precious, fragile, and fiercely defended. And they would protect it, together, against any threat, any danger, any betrayal. They would hold on to this moment, because they knew, in the pit of their stomachs, more challenges were coming. Chapter 15. Reckoning with the Ghosts of the Past. The summons arrived unexpectedly, a terse message delivered by one of Enzo's most trusted men. Alessandro was calling a meeting, a consiglio, a gathering of the family's key members. It was a blatant power play, a challenge to Enzo's authority, a move designed to force a confrontation. Enzo knew that he couldn't ignore the summons. To do so would be seen as a sign of weakness, an admission of defeat. He had to face Alessandro, confront him, put an end to his betrayal once and for all. "It's time," he said to Caterina, his voice grim, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "I have to go." Caterina felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She knew that this meeting was dangerous, that it could be a trap, that Enzo's life was on the line. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice firm. Enzo shook his head.
"No," he said.
"It's too dangerous. I need you to stay here, stay safe." "I will not stay here while you face him alone," she insisted. "I'm your wife, Enzo. I belong by your side." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. He knew that he couldn't dissuade her, that her determination was as strong as his own. "All right," he said finally. "But you stay close to me. And you do exactly as I say." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I will." They prepared for the meeting, Enzo gathering his most loyal men, arming themselves, preparing for any eventuality. Caterina dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, her hair pulled back, her expression resolute. She looked every bit the mafia wife, a woman of strength, of courage, of unwavering loyalty. They arrived at the meeting place, a grand, centuries-old villa that had been in the Costa family for generations. It was a place steeped in history, in tradition, in blood. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation and dread. The other family members were already assembled, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and fear. Alessandro sat at the head of the long, ornate table, his expression smug, his eyes filled with a cold ambition. Enzo and Caterina entered the room, their heads held high, their steps deliberate. They took their seats at the table, facing Alessandro, their presence a silent challenge to his authority. The meeting began with the usual formalities, the recounting of old grievances, the discussion of family business. But it was clear that everyone was waiting for the main event, the confrontation between Enzo and Alessandro. Finally, Alessandro rose from his seat, his voice booming across the room. "I have called this meeting," he said, "to address a serious issue. An issue that threatens the very foundation of our family." He looked directly at Enzo, his eyes filled with malice. "My cousin Enzo Costa," he said, "has proven himself to be unfit to lead. He has violated our traditions, he has betrayed our trust, he has dishonored our family." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I, therefore, challenge him for the leadership of the Costa family." A gasp went around the room. This was it, the moment of truth. The reckoning with the ghosts of the past, the settling of old scores, the battle for the future of the family. And Caterina, sitting beside Enzo, her hand clasped tightly in his, knew that her life, their life, would never be the same. The challenge had been issued. The battle lines were drawn. And the ghosts of the past were about to be awakened. Chapter 16. The Shattered Mirror of Trust. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the occasional nervous cough or the shifting of chairs. All eyes were on Enzo, waiting for his response, anticipating his reaction. Caterina felt his hand tighten around hers, a silent reassurance, a source of strength in the face of overwhelming odds. Enzo rose slowly from his seat, his gaze sweeping across the room, his expression calm, his voice controlled. "My cousin, Alessandro," he said, "makes serious accusations. Accusations that I will not let stand unanswered." He looked directly at Alessandro, his eyes filled with a steely determination. "You speak of tradition, of honor, of family," he said. "But your actions speak of greed, of ambition, of betrayal." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You accuse me of violating our traditions," he continued. "But it is you who has violated the most sacred tradition of all, loyalty. You have plotted against me. You have conspired with our enemies. You have sought to destroy me." Alessandro scoffed, his expression dismissive. "These are baseless accusations," he said. "You have no proof." Enzo smiled, a cold, mirthless smile that sent a shiver down Caterina's spine. "Oh, I have proof, cousin," he said. "More than enough proof." He signaled to one of his men, who stepped forward, carrying a small, leather-bound book. It was a ledger, a detailed record of Alessandro's dealings with the Romanos, his payments, his promises, his treachery. "This," Enzo said, holding up the ledger, "is the proof of your betrayal. A detailed account of your collaboration with our enemies, your plans to usurp my position, your disloyalty." A gasp went around the room. The evidence was irrefutable, the betrayal undeniable. Alessandro's face paled, his smug expression replaced by a look of shock and fear. "This is a forgery," he stammered, his voice losing its confidence.
A fabrication.
Enzo shook his head.
"You know it's not," he said.
"And so does everyone else in this room." He looked around the room, his gaze meeting the eyes of the other family members. "I have led this family with honor," he said. "I have protected our interests, I have upheld our traditions, I have always put the family first." He paused, his voice filled with emotion. "But I will not tolerate betrayal," he said. "I will not allow anyone, not even my own cousin, to undermine our family, to threaten our security, to destroy what we have built. He turned back to Alessandro, his eyes filled with a cold fury. You have made your choice, cousin, he said. And now you will face the consequences. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anticipation and dread. The shattered mirror of trust reflected the fractured loyalties, the broken promises, the inevitable violence. Caterina, sitting beside Enzo, her hand still clasped tightly in his, knew that this was a turning point, a moment of reckoning, a battle for the very soul of the family. And she was ready to fight, alongside the man she loved, for the future they had dreamed of, for the life they had chosen together. The decision, whatever it was, would ripple through their lives forever. Chapter 17. In the crucible of fire and blood. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Alessandro, waiting for his reaction, anticipating his next move. He stood there, frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. He knew that he was cornered, that his betrayal had been exposed, that his ambition had been thwarted. He looked around the room, his gaze searching for support, for allies, for a way out. But he found none. The other family members, once swayed by his promises, his charisma, his lies, now looked at him with disdain, with contempt, with disgust. He had underestimated Enzo. He had underestimated his cousin's loyalty, his strength, his ruthlessness. He had believed that he could manipulate the family, that he could seize power, that he could win. He had been wrong. He looked at Enzo, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and desperation. You may have won this battle, cousin, he said, his voice trembling, but you have not won the war. Enzo smiled, a cold, mirthless smile that sent a shiver down Caterina's spine. There is no war, Alessandro, he said. Only consequences. He nodded to his men, a silent signal, a prearranged command. They moved swiftly, surrounding Alessandro, their weapons drawn, their expressions grim. Alessandro panicked, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape, a way out. But there was none. He was trapped, surrounded, his fate sealed. Wait, he pleaded, his voice cracking.
We can talk about this.
We can find a solution. Enzo shook his head. There is no solution, Alessandro, he said. You made your choice. You betrayed your family. And now you must pay the price. Caterina watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She knew that this was the way of the mafia, the brutal, unforgiving code of honor that governed their lives. Betrayal was met with swift, decisive, and often fatal consequences. She looked at Enzo, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and understanding. She knew that he had no choice, that he had to do what was necessary to protect his family, his position, his love. Alessandro, seeing the finality in Enzo's eyes, made one last, desperate move. He lunged for a gun hidden beneath his jacket, his intention clear, to take Enzo down with him, to die fighting, to avenge his defeat. But he was too slow. Enzo's men reacted instantly, their gunfire erupting in a deafening roar, their bullets finding their mark, their aim true. Alessandro crumpled to the floor, his body riddled with bullets, his life extinguished in a matter of seconds. The silence that followed was even more profound than before, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and death. Caterina felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had witnessed violence before, but this was different. This was personal. This was family. Enzo turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and relief. He reached for her hand, his touch reassuring, his presence a source of strength in the midst of the chaos. It's over, he said softly. It's finally over. The other family members, shaken but resolute, reaffirmed their loyalty to Enzo, pledging their allegiance, vowing their support. The crucible of fire and blood had tested their bonds, had exposed their weaknesses, had forged a new, stronger unity. Enzo, his authority reaffirmed, his position secured, his enemies vanquished, looked at Caterina, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. He had protected his family, he had upheld his honor, he had won. But the victory was bittersweet, the cost high. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, but their shadows lingered, a reminder of the violence, the betrayal, the inescapable realities of the mafia world. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Enzo and Caterina would face it together, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness, their bond stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of fire and blood. The scene was brutal, but it was definitive. Chapter 18. The Dawn of a New Allegiance. The aftermath of Alessandro's death was a whirlwind of activity. Enzo, with his usual efficiency, orchestrated the cleanup, the disposal of the body, the silencing of any potential witnesses. He moved with a quiet authority, his network of contacts working tirelessly to erase any trace of the violence that had transpired. Caterina, though shaken by the events, stood by Enzo's side, offering her support, her strength, her love. She had witnessed the brutal reality of the mafia world, the unforgiving consequences of betrayal, the inescapable cycle of violence. But she had also seen Enzo's unwavering loyalty, his fierce protectiveness, his deep love for her. The other family members, once divided by Alessandro's treachery, now rallied around Enzo, their allegiance renewed, their loyalty reaffirmed. They had seen the strength of his leadership, the ruthlessness of his justice, the depth of his commitment to the family. Enzo, with Caterina by his side, addressed the family, his voice firm, his expression resolute. "We have faced a great challenge," he said, "a betrayal that threatened to tear us apart. But we have overcome it. We have emerged stronger, more united, more determined." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We will learn from this," he continued. "We will strengthen our bonds. We will reinforce our loyalty. We will never forget the price of betrayal." He looked at Caterina, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. "And we will build a new future," he said. "A future based on trust, on respect, on love." His words resonated with the family members, their faces reflecting a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to the future, a dawn of a new allegiance. In the days that followed, Enzo began to implement changes within the family, streamlining operations, consolidating power, eliminating any remaining traces of Alessandro's influence. He promoted those who had remained loyal, rewarded those who had shown courage, and punished those who had wavered. He also made a significant change, one that surprised many within the family. He appointed Caterina as his consigliera, his advisor, his confidant, his partner. "You have shown great strength, great wisdom, great loyalty," he said to her. "You have a unique perspective, a different way of seeing things. You will be my voice of reason, my guiding light, my strength." Caterina accepted the position with humility and determination. She knew that it was a significant responsibility, a challenge, a test. But she was ready. She had learned much in the past few weeks. She had seen the darkness. She had faced the danger. She had found her voice. Together, Enzo and Caterina began to reshape the Costa family, steering it in a new direction, forging a new path, creating a new legacy. They focused on legitimate businesses, on community involvement, on building a better future for the next generation. They also made time for themselves, for their love, for their new life together. They explored the countryside, they visited ancient ruins, they shared quiet moments, they cherished each other. The dawn of a new allegiance had arrived, a new era of peace and prosperity, a future built on trust, on respect, on love. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, the wounds were healing, the future was bright. And Enzo and Caterina, hand in hand, heart to heart, were ready to face it, together, stronger than ever, their love a beacon of hope in the ever-changing landscape of their lives. The transformation was not complete, but it was well underway. Chapter 19. Embracing the shadows, claiming the light. Years passed, and the Costa family flourished under Enzo and Caterina's leadership. They had successfully transitioned the family's focus from primarily illicit activities to a blend of legitimate businesses and carefully managed, discreet operations. The violence and bloodshed that had once defined their lives were replaced by a cautious peace, a fragile stability, a hard-won tranquility. Caterina had proven to be an invaluable consigliera, her wisdom and intuition guiding Enzo through difficult decisions, her compassion and empathy tempering his ruthlessness, her love a constant source of strength. She had earned the respect of the family members, not through fear or intimidation, but through her genuine concern for their well-being, her unwavering commitment to their future, her unyielding integrity. They had built a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with purpose. They had created a home, a sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves, where they could be vulnerable, where they could be happy. But the shadows of the past still lingered, a constant reminder of the world they inhabited, the dangers they had faced, the price they had paid for their freedom. They knew that their peace was fragile, that it could be shattered at any moment, that the threat of violence, of betrayal, of loss was always present. One evening, as they were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset over the rolling hills, Caterina turned to Enzo, her eyes filled with a thoughtful reflection. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice soft. "This life? The choices we've made? The risks we've taken?" Enzo looked at her, his gaze filled with a deep, unwavering love. "Never," he said. "Not for a moment. I would do it all again, every single thing, to be with you." He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "We have built something beautiful, Caterina," he said. "Something strong, something lasting. We have embraced the shadows, and we have claimed the light." Caterina smiled, her heart filled with a profound sense of gratitude, of contentment, of love. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her happiness. She had found a love that was stronger than fear, a love that had defied the odds, a love that had transformed her life. They continued to face challenges, to navigate the complexities of the mafia world, to protect their family, their legacy, their love. But they faced them together, hand in hand, heart to heart, their bond unbreakable, their spirit undimmed, their future secure. They had learned to balance the darkness and the light, to embrace the shadows and claim the sun, to live a life that was both dangerous and beautiful, a life that was uniquely their own. They had found a way to honor the past while building a new future, a future where loyalty, respect, and love were the cornerstones of their existence. And that, they knew, was a legacy worth fighting for. The journey had been long and arduous, but the destination, a life lived authentically and together, was worth every scar, every sacrifice, every moment. They were finally at peace, not just with the world, but with themselves. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. A new threat emerged, not from within the family, but from an unexpected external source. A rival organization, sensing an opportunity to expand their territory and influence, began to encroach upon the Costa family's businesses, employing intimidation tactics, threatening violence, and challenging Enzo's authority. Enzo, initially, tried to resolve the situation through diplomacy, through negotiation, through reason. He offered concessions, he proposed compromises, he sought a peaceful resolution. But his efforts were met with resistance, with aggression, with contempt. The rival organization, led by a young, ambitious, and ruthless capo named Riccardo D'Angelo, was determined to provoke a conflict, to force a confrontation, to take what they believed was rightfully theirs. D'Angelo sent a message to Enzo, a blatant challenge, an ultimatum: surrender your businesses, relinquish your power, or face the consequences. Enzo knew that he could not back down. To do so would be seen as a sign of weakness, an invitation for further aggression, a betrayal of his family's trust. He had to stand firm, he had to defend his territory, he had to fight. He gathered his men, his loyal soldiers, his family. He explained the situation, he outlined the risks, he prepared them for war. Caterina, standing by his side, her hand clasped tightly in his, offered her support, her wisdom, her love. "We will face this together, Enzo," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a steely determination. "We will not be intimidated. We will not surrender. We will prevail." Enzo and Caterina, leading their forces, met with D'Angelo and his men at a neutral location, a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation and dread. D'Angelo, arrogant and confident, reiterated his demands, his voice dripping with contempt. "You are a relic of the past, Costa," he said. "Your time is over. Surrender now, and I might spare your life." Enzo smiled, a cold, mirthless smile that sent a shiver down Caterina's spine. "I am not afraid of you, D'Angelo," he said, "and I will never surrender. This is my family, my territory, my life, and I will defend it to my last breath." The confrontation escalated, words turning into threats, threats turning into violence. A gunfight erupted, the warehouse echoing with a deafening roar of gunfire, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Caterina, though initially hesitant to participate in the violence, found herself caught in the crossfire. She fought alongside Enzo, her movements surprisingly fluid, her aim true. She had learned much from Enzo. She had embraced the shadows. She had claimed her strength. The battle raged, men falling on both sides, the warehouse becoming a scene of chaos and death. Enzo and D'Angelo, face to face, engaged in a brutal, hand-to-hand combat, their hatred for each other fueling their fury. Caterina, seeing Enzo struggling, intervened, distracting D'Angelo, giving Enzo the opportunity to strike the final blow. D'Angelo fell, defeated, his ambition extinguished, his threat eliminated. The remaining members of D'Angelo's organization, seeing their leader defeated, surrendered, their resistance broken, their spirit crushed. Enzo, wounded but alive, turned to Caterina, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. He had won, he had defended his family, he had protected his legacy. But the victory was costly. Many of Enzo's men had been killed or injured. The warehouse was destroyed, the peace shattered. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties had tested their strength, their courage, their love. They had faced the darkness, they had embraced the shadows, they had claimed the light. And they had emerged, scarred but unbroken, their bond stronger than ever, their future uncertain but hopeful. The cost of peace, they realized, was always vigilance. And they were prepared to pay it together. This was their life. And they would live it and defend it until their last breaths. Epilogue. The sun set over the Italian countryside, casting a warm, golden glow over the rolling hills and the sprawling vineyards of the Costo estate. Enzo and Caterina, now older, their hair streaked with more silver, their faces etched with the lines of time and experience, stood on the terrace, their hands clasped together, their shoulders touching. They had rebuilt their lives, their family, their legacy. The violence of the past had faded, replaced by a hard-won peace, a fragile tranquility, a deeply cherished love. They had raised children, watched grandchildren grow, and witnessed the continuation of the Costa family, a family that had been transformed, reformed, and renewed. Enzo had stepped down as the head of the family, passing the leadership to his eldest son, a young man who had inherited his father's strength and his mother's wisdom. He was a new kind of leader, one who embraced both tradition and progress, who understood the importance of both loyalty and compassion. Caterina, still his trusted advisor, his confidant, his love, remained by his side, offering her guidance, her support, her unwavering devotion. They looked out at the landscape, at the beauty that surrounded them, at the life they had built together. They had faced challenges, overcome obstacles, endured losses, and celebrated triumphs. They had lived a life of danger and excitement, of passion and love, of shadows and light. "We did it, Caterina," Enzo said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "We survived. We thrived. We loved." Caterina smiled, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy, of gratitude, of contentment. "Yes, my love," she said. "We did." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her happiness. She had found a love that was stronger than fear, a love that had defied the odds, a love that had transformed her life. They stood there, silhouetted against the setting sun, two souls entwined, two hearts beating as one, two lives intertwined forever. They had embraced the shadows, they had claimed the light, they had lived a life that was both dangerous and beautiful, a life that was uniquely their own. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they knew that their love, their legacy, their story would live on, a testament to the power of courage, the strength of loyalty, and the enduring beauty of a love that had conquered all. The final chapter was written, not in ink, but in the quiet moments, the shared glances, the enduring love that had defined their extraordinary lives. They had found their forever, and it was more beautiful than they could have ever imagined. The end.